Hey, so I decided to do my presentation on adultery and divorce according to Augustine, the Bible, and the Catholic Church. The purpose of this presentation is not just to observe the morality of divorce. We all know as Catholics that this is considered to be a sin. Rather, I wanted to look at how divorce is perceived by Christians throughout the different eras of Christianity. I also want to understand the significance of Christ's teaching in relation to the era and civilization that embraced it. And then finally, I want to focus on what kind of distinctions may exist between the Bible, Augustine, and the Catholic Church. So the first thing, and probably the most important thing I need to say, is that Jesus unequivocally condemns divorce in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, it was permitted for a man to have a divorce if there was some reason that he saw his wife as unclean. It doesn't mention the reverse genders, but this is the old law, and it was condoned by Moses. Christ condemns this and says that it's because of the hardness of Moses' heart that he allowed this to happen. He says that whoever can, what does Jesus say? Jesus says that whoever divorces his wife makes her an adulterer, is an adulterer, and whoever makes her an adulteress. So whoever divorces his wife is an adulterer, and also makes his wife an adulteress. The only exception that Christ allows for this, the only exception Christ mentions is except in the case of fornication. Okay? So if one spouse is not being true to the other, Christ allows for somebody to put away his wife. Now, I'm going to talk about what it means to put away one's wife, or like the actual word that Jesus uses, or Matthew uses when talking about these events in the Bible, but I'll get there later. The point is, though, he uses that word put away, and he doesn't necessarily use the word divorce, although putting away would include divorce. So Jesus is condemning anybody who separates from their wife except for fornication, except for the purpose of fornication, on the grounds of fornication. So, while Jesus has this exception for fornication, St. Paul has a slightly different take. I don't think they're in contradiction with each other, but I do think Paul is mentioning something that Christ doesn't mention. So, and known as the Pauline privilege in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 10 to 15, St. Paul says that when a woman or a man is joined together and one of the spouses becomes baptized, and the other spouse chooses to leave that baptized person is not obligated to stay united to the person who left him. Okay, now there's different interpretations as what that means. Let her go. Like, can he get remarried? These are questions I'll talk about a little bit later. But the point is, it's permitted that there be a separation if one partner, the unbaptized partner, decides to leave the baptized partner. Now, the specific instance St. Paul is talking about is one where a person becomes Christian, then their spouse leaves. Notice that he doesn't mention partners that agree to get married on the condition that one is already Christian, the other isn't. So he's not talking about mixed marriages per se. And he's also saying that it's good for these couples to stay together. So his preference is definitely for unity. He's just mentioning a situation where he's speaking to one person in this relationship what to do if his spouse or her spouse leaves him or her. Now, Augustine, having of course read both Christ's words on the matter and St. Paul's words, mentions divorce three different places. The first and probably the most obvious one is the Sermon on the Mount, which is something he wrote a commentary on in his De Sermone Domini in Monte. So during the Sermon on the Mount, Christ turns the old law on its head. He says, "You have heard that whoever commits a bill up for divorce, etc., etc." So Christ is telling them what they already know about divorce. But then he says, I tell you that whoever divorces his wife has made her an adulteress. So Christ is taking the old law and he's turning it on its head, saying that the old view of divorce is no longer allowed. And that's what he does in the Sermon on the Mount. Later, Augustine also writes about the same issue in response to his friend Polentius in his work on adulterous marriages, or in Latin, De Adulterenis Connuigis. Then finally, he references all of his work in the past, particularly how difficult it was to write about marriage in his work Retractions. But in his work on adulterous marriages, this is where we really get to hear about Augustine's opinions on just how strict he is on marriage. So Polentius writes to him, and we don't see exactly what Polentius writes in Augustine's work, but the area of disagreement becomes clear. Augustine says fornication is the only acceptable reason to divorce one's spouse. Polentius, on the other hand, thinks there's reasons to divorce that don't involve fornication. This is the first area of their disagreement. The second area is this. Polentius believes when divorce involves fornication, it is acceptable for the spouses to be remarried. Augustine believes even when fornication occurs and the spouses are separated, the Christian spouse is not free to get remarried even if his former spouse is remarried. In the first part of the Pauline privilege, St. Paul says, and if she depart, that she remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Here, St. Paul interprets this to mean that he is giving her a choice, either to remain unmarried, meaning she can't get remarried, or she should reconcile with her husband. Polentius reads this and says, well, if she can't get remarried and has to remain unmarried, it must be for a case not involving fornication, because in Polentius's mind, fornication is the only grounds on which a person can be remarried if his spouse commits fornication. Augustine interprets this to be rather a spiritual form of fornication, meaning the person's partner has left and he doesn't believe she is free to be remarried. So the question of whether or not the Pauline privilege allows somebody to be remarried is a huge issue of contention between Polentius and Augustine. And the situation that's being described, there's a dispute as to what the actual situation is. Polentius, as mentioned before, believes it's in the case not involving fornication, which is why she's not allowed to get remarried. And Augustine is just saying, no, she's just not allowed to get remarried, period. And the only reason why she's allowed to be separated is because it's a form of spiritual fornication for one's partner to reject the faith. He later, in his work at Retractions, talks about how difficult it was to come to this conclusion, and that he expressed some lack of confidence on the issue. But at the same time, he doesn't retract anything. He just says it was a difficult position to hold, and it was difficult for him to come to this conclusion. Okay, and this slide here just basically restates what I just said. Now, discussing Polentius and Augustine's disagreement, it's a good thing to maybe have a little bit of a context as to how they understood marriage. Since if you want to understand marriage, or if you want to understand divorce, it's important to understand what they mean by marriage. So in the Catholic Church, it's defined as a sacrament. And sacrament defined by most Catholics, and in the Children's Catholic Catechism, it says an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. That's the Baltimore Catechism. Meaning it's a sign of some spiritual act. Now, Augustine was familiar with this definition. However, when he uses the word sacrament, he's not always using it in this way, because in Roman law, the word sacramentum, which is the same word, not just the same root, but the same word translated, was usually said in regard to somebody's oath. And this is relevant because marriage really is an oath. In the case that somebody violates a marriage or breaks up with their partner in a marriage, they are violating an oath. Now, does that oath cease to exist? No. If I promise that I will work out every day for the rest of my life and I stop working out, I haven't gotten rid of that promise. I've just violated it. So even on completely secular grounds, divorce is a violation of one's oath. And Augustine saw a problem with this, even on secular grounds, because Christ said, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. So even if he didn't accept marriage as this holy act, he saw divorce as a sort of lie or dishonesty. It means what you said earlier doesn't count as true. Now, this understanding of marriage is different from some other understandings of marriage, and it's also different from some other understandings of divorce. So, divorce is not always seen as just the breaking of a promise. In biblical terms, the words that are usually used to describe the separation that occurs are not necessarily divorce as we contemporarily understand the term. So Augustine was familiar with the scriptures, and he read the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's translation of the Septuagint. But these were translations of Greek words like apolio. And apolio meant, it could mean to divorce, but first and foremost, it meant to release, dismiss, let go, or send away. Now, that means separation. That doesn't necessarily mean divorce in the case of dissolving a marriage bond. The second word, horizo, let separate, put apart, to depart, withdraw, also is different from dissolving a marriage bond. It just means separation. The word aphemi can be translated to mean divorce, but it primarily means to separate. So these terms, the three terms that Paul uses and Christ uses in the gospel, first and foremost refer to separation. Only aphemi sometimes means to dissolve. However, if we look at modern definitions for divorce, the Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as the act by which a valid marriage is dissolved. So it's talking about the bond in a marriage being destroyed, as if it never happened. Webster defines it as the action or an instance of legally dissolving a marriage bond, or as separation or severance. So you can see a difference in understanding. So the Gospels, when they talk about the separation of partners, they're not talking about divorce as we understand it per se. They're just talking about separation or letting go. Now, there's a whole bunch of context to that. Considering back in those times, if you left a woman, it would be more disastrous. So in many ways, it could be understood as synonymous with dissolving a marriage bond. So you're basically leaving the wife for dead or something. But that's still not exactly the same thing. If I say a marriage never took place, and I say I'm violating my marriage vows, those are two different statements. And leaving one's partner in the antiquity is not the same thing as destroying that marriage partner's bond. Now, if we look at modern Catholic definitions for marriage, it says the essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility, meaning a marriage cannot be dissolved. It's an irrevocable covenant. This is coming from canon law. The Catechism says it must be done for their whole life. So if marriage is defined as a promise made for a person's entire life, on account of someone's entire life, that by definition is not something that can be dissolved. It's an oath that can't be taken back. Violating an oath doesn't get rid of the oath. Now, the Catholic Catechism also goes on to mention that separation can be permitted in certain situations, especially if it means the care of children or the protection of inheritance. So civil divorce is not always a sin, so to speak, but divorce, as understood by the Catholic Church, is always an impossibility. Now, if somebody reads Cardinal Ratzinger's document or prefects and norms for the preparation of the process for the dissolution of the marriage bond in favor of the faith, they're likely to be very confused because this document uses a lot of modern terminology to describe the phenomena of the Pauline privilege. So it's important to note that a lot of progress or a lot of development to the Pauline privilege has taken place over the years that differs it from Augustine's stance on the issue. First and foremost, Cardinal Ratzinger, this is before he was Pope Benedict XVI, said that a great deal of this comes from the understanding of the word to depart. Since, as already mentioned before, separation and divorce are not the same thing. They're not even the same concept. But this becomes confusing because Cardinal Ratzinger also uses the word dissolution to the bond. It's right there in the title. He says that they can dissolve a marriage if it's in favor of the faithful. Now, I don't know the exact theological justification for using the term dissolving a lifelong oath made. Perhaps it's said that any oath that comes in conflict with God's divine law is not an oath that you should make in the first place. Therefore, it's not a good, legitimate oath. Perhaps that's the reason. This case, it's done for the sake of saving souls or for the faithful, in favor of the faith. So it's for a greater purpose. But generally speaking, we say the ends don't justify the means. So there's sort of a principle of double effect perhaps here, where you can say you're dissolving the marriage bond, but it's not clear exactly what it means by dissolving the marriage bond. But while it's not exactly clear what's meant, it is clear that it is an exception. This is not something that Cardinal Ratzinger is saying should be the norm. And he's also not saying the effect of this is more or less the same as what Augustine describes, because both are justifications for separation. The major difference is that St. Paul doesn't specify remarriage, while Augustine does specify that he's against remarriage. And here, in this same document, Cardinal Ratzinger implies, using canon law as his sources, that remarriage is permissible for cases involving the Pauline privilege. So it seems remarriage is right. So both Polentius and Augustine are right in certain respects. Polentius is right that those involved in the Pauline privilege can be remarried. St. Augustine is right because he acknowledges that a marriage can't be dissolved. Only separation can occur. So here, perhaps maybe it's an annulment of some sort, saying that the marriage never took place because there's a higher power at stake. The theology is not clear to me per se. I don't want to repeat myself too much on that point, but my takeaway is that there is a difference between the Catholic Church's stance on the Pauline privilege and that of Augustine. And that difference, while the terminology would seem to be that because Augustine uses the word divorce, that he's stricter than the Church, that's actually not the case, because Augustine is using the word divorce in a much more loose sense of the word, while the Catholic Church is using the word dissolving the marriage bond, which is a much more consequential. Like it's a lot more. It has a lot more effects on marriage than just separation. So, if a husband goes away on a business trip and never comes back, he's separated from his wife, but he hasn't destroyed that marriage bond. And Augustine saw the Pauline privilege as something to that effect, while the church sees it as a dissolving of the marriage bond. And it doesn't use the word divorce. The Catholic Church doesn't say that they can divorce one spouse, but it does talk about, or at least Cardinal Ratzinger uses the word dissolve in this situation. So let's summarize some points from this presentation. First and foremost, the Catholic Church is against divorce, as is Augustine. But Augustine uses the word divorce to mean just separation, and the Catholic Church is in favor of separation. So they're both in favor of separation in certain circumstances. But the rules of how one goes about separating is stricter in the case of Augustine. Paul tolerates separation when an unbelieving spouse leaves a believer, and Christ does so in the case of fornication. So this is rooted in the Bible. It's not something that either Augustine or the church made up. Augustine and Pallentius disagreed over whether or not Christian spouses could be remarried if the unbelieving spouse leaves them, right? So this only works if the unbelieving spouse leaves a believing partner. The believing partner is supposed to stay united with the unbelieving partner to the best of their abilities. And they also disagree over whether or not fornication is the only grounds for a divorce. So Augustine would say fornication is the only grounds for a divorce, and he interprets the Pauline privilege as a spiritual fornication, while Pallentius takes it as an instance of clear grounds for divorce that doesn't involve fornication. I would say perhaps Pallentius is more in line with the Catholic Church, although we don't know the extent of what he said and what kind of grounds he said were necessary. Considering how loose their definition of the word divorce was, and considering how relatively less, or how relatively also loose the Catholic Church's definition of annulments and separation are. These words differ in how they're used throughout the eras and generation. So the Catholic Church recognizes that a marriage is a permanent bond, and Augustine recognizes this too.